At some point in the last century, the 3,000 or so original handmade clay tiles had been replaced by these horrible cement sheets. Some of them had cracked or had fallen off the roof completely, allowing rainwater to slowly rot away sections of the oak frame. The first job then was to safely remove them from the roof, and as they were sometimes made with asbestos, we took precautions. Then it was time to strip the rafters, and yes, a lot of them were fine and probably could have been reused. But we were going to try something a little different with this roof, something that hasn't really been done much before. Triangular rafters. So it meant we needed a whole bunch of new ones that were more or less identical to each other. And the original ones, well, they definitely weren't. Once all the rafters were off, we could see the full extent of the damage caused by the leaking roof. Decades of rain had slowly rotted away this third arch, way beyond repair, so the only option was to cut the entire section out with the chainsaw and lower it using this 2-ton block and tackle.
Excellent.
And apologies for the focus here, but I hope you can see just how much damage a small amount of rain can cause over a long period of time. We immediately started rebuilding the section in green oak, which is just the term for freshly cut oak which will gradually dry and shrink by around 10%. It's a lot easier to cut and work than seasoned or dried oak, but it's also a lot heavier. And we get all of ours from a local sawmill run by two brothers in their 70s that we'll actually be going to later in this video. It's an incredible place in the middle of a forest and definitely doesn't have internet. So the only way to order is to call during the lunch break so they can actually hear the phone ring. And if you miss that window, you have to wait another 24 hours before you can try again. It's about as French as it can get. We then fixed 2 blocks onto the chainsaw bar, which allowed us to use the original beam as a template. Now, this is definitely not the quickest way to do it, or the most elegant, but there are many ways to skin a cat.
Stop! Hammer time!
This beam has a total of 6 mortises, 4 on the top for the studs and 2 long ones on the bottom for the knee braces. And if you've ever drilled and chiseled a mortise by hand, you will know just how long they can take. So when I saw this chain mortiser listed like new on Gumtree for an absolute steal, it was fate. It saved at least 2 days of work and leaves you with a much cleaner and perfectly square mortise.
A few moments later.
Next, we had to replicate the housing for the knee braces, and this was a bit of a head scratcher until we figured out that we could use this offcut as a ramp for the circular saw. So instead of a flat cut, we could make a sloping cut, which mirrored the first, before then removing the ramp and chiseling down into that cut. Once we'd finished the curved beam, I moved on to making the 4 studs that fix the beam and the top plate together. After we'd assembled the frame, we ratcheted everything tight and began to spot the tenons. And this is when you just nick the tenon with your drill bit to mark it, and then you pull the joint apart and offset the hole from that mark by a couple of mil, which means that when you come to knock the peg in, it pulls the tenon deeper into the mortise and should prevent any gaps appearing over time as the wood shrinks. Apparently this isn't very common in America, but for green oak, because of that 10% shrinkage, it's absolutely essential. The last piece of this puzzle were the 2 knee braces, which we started the same day I received a package from the lovely people at Festool, which included this sword saw. In the absence of a large bandsaw, it meant we could cut through these oak slabs in one pass. And once we'd removed the riving knife, it was able to cut the curves too, which would have saved us a lot of time back when we were making the beam. But hey, there are many ways, right? Once the knee braces were finished, it was just a case of sanding everything with 80 grit, in particular to get rid of these black stains caused by the steel bandsaw reacting with the wet oak.
Sit.
And for anyone who's noticed my absence during this stage of the build, I was actually in the middle of a flare-up caused by an autoimmune disease I have called ankylosing spondylitis, which attacks the hips and spine. It's arthritis, but in your 20s. So I was behind the camera for a couple of weeks whilst I got that under control. And now you might be thinking, well, what am I doing in this kind of work? But this is probably the best thing for it. Lots of varied movement and freedom to take it easy if and when I need to, and let everyone else do the heavy lifting. Because thankfully we had some extra hands at this point, without which we would have been stuffed.
Damper in the middle.
Okay. Yeah, no.
Maybe hold it then, I'll go and check it out.
Good, Carl?
Yeah.
After we had each piece in situ, we used a combination of 20 and 25mm oak pegs to lock everything together. And once these go in, I can tell you from painful experience, there's very little chance of getting them out again without making a complete pig's ear of it. So you better be happy with how your joints look at this point. This was a really big milestone, and we were almost a month in by this point. In a few years, the green oak will fade to the same greyish colour as the rest of the frame, and only if you look really closely, or if you've seen this video, will you know that they were built 300 years apart. The next issue was the remaining top plate, which we hadn't ripped out. The bottom ends of the original rafters had sat in these notches cut directly into the plate, which had left it pretty much unusable for any new rafters, especially the type we had in mind. So the simplest solution was to cut a small rebate, or rabbet to any Americans, and attach a new top plate onto the old one. The ridge beams were in a similarly poor condition. I don't have great footage, but sections of them were flaking away and would have been impossible to fix the new rafters onto, so they needed replacing. However, removing them entirely would have been an enormous job, so instead we used the same strategy of fixing new beams onto the old. But as we weren't planning to use birds' mouths on the new rafters, more on that later, we took this opportunity to cut 2 bevels on the new ridge at the angle of the roof pitch, so that the rafters could just sit flat on top. And if that doesn't make sense, you'll see what I mean very shortly. Lifting timbers onto or off of this roof was one of the biggest challenges of this build, but using only the combination of a good block and tackle, ratchet straps, clamps, plenty of T-brakes and at least 2 different opinions, we managed to lift every ridge and purlin onto this roof without a crane, all casualties, except for my brand new camera, which fell 6 meters off the roof onto solid hardcore.
Whoa. It's not going anywhere.
It is.
Fucking long.
Okay.
Hurrah!
The 2 12-meter long purlins that support the middle of the rafters were next, and I can only imagine that whoever picked this tree had just come back from a particularly long Friday lunch break. In contrast, the front purlin was in good condition, but was too low for the new pitch, so it made sense to replace both. We didn't even attempt to order 12-metre oak beams from the sawmill. For one, there was no way to collect them as they'd be longer than the truck and trailer combined, not to mention how difficult it would be to lift them up. So we had to order 3 at 4 metres, and the best way to join beams together lengthways is a scarf joint.
Come on. That's pretty good. Yeah, that's it.
Getting these 12-metre long purlins down really makes you wonder how they got them up there in the first place. And once we had this one off, we had a decision. Leave it at 12 metres and come up with a use for it later, because how often do you come across an oak beam of that length? Or cut it up. And once we realised we couldn't get it out past the scaffold in one piece, and it'd be in the way of the cars if we left it, the decision was made, even if it was a sad one. But after playing around with ideas of what to do with this lovely seasoned oak, including this enormous doorstop, I've come up with a product. Oak coasters CNC lasered with the original stonework engraving from back when the roof was built and this tree was cut down in 1732. And the great thing about these is that they're relatively cheap to post. So if anyone wants a small piece of this project to keep for themselves or to give as a gift, please go check them out at carlrogers.co. All orders will come with free shipping, and because they're made entirely in-house, I can guarantee you'll have them by Christmas. And it goes without saying that every purchase helps support the content on this channel, so thanks for listening, and also well done for making it halfway through this video. I know it's a long one. After we set up a string line to represent the underside of the new rafters, we needed to cut a notch out of the A-frame that was parallel to this, and into which we could then fix this oak packer, which, if we got our measurements right, would raise the height of the new purlin to hopefully just nip the string line.
I'll take that out. Left.
I almost cut the second purlin from this video. However, we'd raised the height of the back stone wall so much, the oak packers on this side of the roof had to be considerably larger than the front, and I thought you'd like to see how I made these up. Very reluctantly, we dug out the largest chunk of oak we owned, and then had the challenge of making a 300mm cut through it, which was achieved by maxing out an 85mm cut on either side, before joining them up in the middle with the sword saw. Then I moved over to everyone's favourite machine, the Lurum Optool 26, a 4-in-1 table saw, thicknesser, surface planer and spindle moulder, which was close to her breaking point with this size of timber. And whoever can point out the most safety hazards in this shot wins a prize. But anyway, these combination machines are a one-stop shop to transform rough-shaped timber into square timber without taking up loads of workshop space. They do come with a bunch of compromises, and it would be nice to have separate machines, considering the size of wood we normally use and the floor space we now have after concreting. But really, this thing is worth its weight in gold. Some of you will have seen just a small fraction of the work this one's done on the house. It's made gates, windows, doors, an entire kitchen, and soon hopefully a staircase. This post had pulled away from its horizontal tie beam and needed repairing before we started adding weight back onto the roof, which could separate it even further. We all know that oak is one of Europe's strongest and most durable hardwoods, hence why it was used to build warships. And this is particularly true when it's been seasoning for 300 years. So there was a small question mark over whether we'd be able to drill a 25mm hole through 350mm of ancient oak. And to be honest, our old Makita wouldn't have been up for it. So it was quite incredible to watch this Festool drill eat through it like a bowl of cornflakes. And that is my honest review. Once we had the frame pulled together, we needed some more oak pegs. And earlier on you saw us shaping one with the block plane. Well, obviously that takes a long time, and after stumbling across this table saw method online, it was worth a punt. But be warned, this is extremely dangerous and can go sideways at any moment, as you're about to see. So only try this if you really understand the machine you're using and what can go wrong. The result was surprisingly good for such a primitive jig, and you can see for yourself just how quick it is. With the frame repaired, we could finally move on to rafters, and for reasons which will become clearer, we wanted them to be triangular. And the easiest way to make one is to split a square rafter diagonally. But after 20 minutes of using the table saw in our workshop, we'd only managed one. So times that by 60 because we needed 120, and that was going to be 3 full days of work just to split the rafters.
Houston, we have a problem.
But remember the two brothers who have the sawmill? Well, they happen to own this beauty. And after a very quick safety induction and risk assessment, they walked off with a few extra euros and left us to it. Again, that's about as French as it can get. 30 seconds later, we'd ripped through the first 4.2 meter oak rafter like a knife through butter. And instead of 3 days, it took us 2 2-hour sessions. Before we could put the rafters on the roof, each one still needed some more work. First, I took the edges off with the circular saw, and this was for 2 reasons. Number 1 was that, believe it or not, when you're chucking rafters around, a sharp angle like this could slice open the palm of your hand if you're not careful. And the second was that by taking off these edges, it meant there'd be a bigger gap between the rafters. So if you're standing below looking up, you'll be able to see more of the tiles rather than just more wood. Next, I chopped the top ends off, and now you can see why we couldn't use birds' mouths like you'd normally do on rafters. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, it's this notch you cut into the rafter so that it can sit flat onto a wall plate or ridge. But because we'd already split ours in half, cutting any more material out, especially from the underside, would practically remove all of the strength. And then it was just a case of spacing the rafters out correctly using these rods and hammering in 4-inch nails. And for anyone wondering why we don't use a nail gun, until they make one that can shoot 4-inch nails into oak consistently, this is the only way to do it. But more importantly, this is the best part of the job.
Yeah.
Instead of cutting the rafters to length on the ground, I'd waited until they were fixed on the roof before running a chalk line and then going along chopping off the feet plumb, which should mean they're all in line. And this is clearly not the safest way to use the track saw, as you're cutting away the material which is supporting the track. So do let me know if anyone can think of a better way that doesn't require individual cuts. I'm patient, but I'm not that patient. Or accurate. The back of the roof is fixed to this stone wall, which also needed a lot of work. We'd poured a concrete ring beam at the start of the project which ties the top length of the wall together and creates a flat surface on which we could start building the Genoa eaves, which you'll find all over France, Italy and Spain. Now, this isn't how it was done 300 years ago, but is a reinvention using modern materials and a few tips and tricks my dad's come up with over the years, which should last a lot longer. And for anyone concerned about the ugly concrete ring beam, this wall will eventually be lime rendered, so it will be hidden. So the Genoise are mostly aesthetic. The idea was that the more rows you had, the wealthier you were. And as this was the farmhouse of the village, they had 1 row. But go to the more expensive houses in France and you'll maybe see up to 3, 4 or even 5. However, you can now buy these fake Genoise, so the feature is no longer that symbolic unless it's done like this, which as you can see is incredibly time consuming.
A lot of work in there.
But once we'd finished them, we still had to install a wall plate to fix our new rafters onto. Although, because it wouldn't be visible, we used Douglas fir, which is a type of pine, instead of oak. Those of you who've seen my videos before might want to skip this, but for anyone else, please let me introduce the final slim prototype. I started designing this tool belt because I was pretty sick of the heavy, cumbersome ones that dominate the market. I wanted something that carried enough basic tools to get by and held them in a way that wouldn't get in your way when climbing up and down roofs, ladders or scaffolds. It also had to look good and be durable enough to handle years of abuse. So this 3-piece set includes the pouch and belt and is handmade in England using full grain leather. But because of the complexity in making and shipping these, I can only really do them once a year. So if you're interested in getting hold of one for yourself, go to carlrogers.co to check them out. But thanks for listening, and now on to the final push. Just in case any rainwater made it past the new tiles, we put a DPM across the top of the wall which should direct this water away from the building. And then because we couldn't use birds' mouths, I cut this wedge to go between the rafters and the wall plate, which was a bit of a pain to make, but actually took a lot less time than it would have to cut 60 individual birds' mouths. All the tiles going back onto the roof were going to be reclaimed clay tiles, handmade on the thighs of local craftsmen and women hundreds of years ago, which means they're all different shapes and sizes and haven't got lugs to prevent them rolling sideways or fixings with which to attach them to roofing batten. Basically, they're a pain in the arse. In the old days, they'd just lay them on top of each other and let gravity hold them in place, which normally ended up with the roof looking like this. And is probably why they replaced the original tiles on our roof with those cement sheets. The whole point of our triangular rafters was so they'd cradle each tile to stop them rolling sideways, and then we'd use these ingenious little hooks to stop them slipping downwards. And the first row of tiles is the most important in this respect, as all the tiles above are bearing down on them. If they can't slip, then those above them can't either, so we directly fix these in place where possible.
6.5 hours later.
And then it was a mad dash to the finish line, because as you can see from the trees, summer was a distant memory and it was starting to get very wet and windy.
Isn't it? That's what kicks it out.
And if you'd like to support this channel, the best way is to hit that subscribe button, and then go and buy yourself some coasters made from the ancient oak off this very roof. Otherwise, if you're a carpenter or DIYer, definitely check out the Slim Tool Belt. But thanks so much for watching, and if you have any questions, write them in a comment down below, and I'll do my best to get back to you.